Hi, welcome. I'm Elizabeth Bernstein, professor of sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies here at Barnard, and a member of the Barnard Center for Research on Women's new research initiative on gender, justice, and neoliberal transformations. So the next panel speaks to exactly where we left off with the last panel in terms of heated discussions of sexual politics. That's where we're going to pick up. So I'd like to welcome you today to the afternoon session for the Public Good Conference, and the final two sessions, really. This is the last panel of the day, and then we're going to have another coffee break, because coffee is very important, as we learned in the earlier, in the lunchtime keynote, and I agree with that. And then we're going to have, and I really encourage you to stay for the final event of today, which is the performance of Ecstatic Corona, which I'll say more about before it begins, but it's a kind of performance ethnography that brings together all of the concerns that we've been talking about today at a very visceral and powerful level, bringing together conversations we've been having about gender, race, love, violence, and through the medium of performance. So I encourage you to really stay to the end. Okay. So let me just sort of link together what we've discussed so far and where we're going next. This morning, we had a fairly robust discussion, I think, of the challenges facing us in addressing conditions of neoliberal privatization in New York and the decimation of public infrastructures in this city. And then Ta-Nehisi Coates followed this with, I think we would all agree, a stunningly powerful account of the intersections of racialized violence that constitute both continuing, indeed foundational, legacies of experience in the US and new targeted forms of racial oppression in contemporary, supposedly post-racial America. Now, the next panel, panelists here, are going to pivot actually in some new directions to add some additional layers of complexity and richness, I hope, we think, to the discussions that we've been having today. And let me just tell you a little bit about how this panel was assembled. So it derives from this new research initiative that I mentioned called Gender Justice and Neoliberal Transformations. And the aim of what we're trying to do here is actually to situate some of what's been occurring in New York City within the context of a broader global field, right? So we're gonna go wildly far afield from New York now to Mexico City, to Buenos Aires, to Seoul, and look at how some of these same issues, and some different issues too, are refracted in other contexts, right? How do questions of privatization, constitutions of good and meaningful publics look in these other contexts? And this project developed actually out of a 2009 Ford Foundation faculty seminar on inequality in New York City, in which faculty from various disciplines were actually seeking to forge precisely the kinds of cross-issue connections that we looked at this morning between homelessness and addiction, education and poverty, migration and policing. And these conversations, in the course of having these conversations, it became clear to us, actually, that it was very important to situate the case of New York in terms of a broader global field. And this is not only to better understand each of these empirical phenomena, but also to challenge the self-evidence of our own analytic and political constructs. In other words, neoliberalism, a term that we have been using throughout the day, means quite different things in Manhattan and Detroit, in Seoul and Buenos Aires. How do these different meanings diverge as well as inform one another? Now, there's a second aim of this afternoon's panel, right, which is to foreground some aspects of neoliberal social transformation that are too often, we would argue, posited as marginal to contemporary economic restructuring, right? In particular, the operations of gender and sexuality. So the scholars here, including myself, have argued that such operations are indeed central to, and not just derivative of, the broader sets of social and structural transformations that we've been discussing, right? To public as well as private issues. In so doing, we build on analyses such as those provided by the feminist scholar Lisa Dugan, whose well-known book, The Twilight of Equality, describes what she calls the dense interrelations amongst neoliberalism's economic and cultural projects, including the sets of social relations organized around gender, race, and nation. And we also build on feminist scholars who've demonstrated the complex intertwining of sex, gender, race, and economics in issues ranging from the welfare state and its possible futures to the substratum of domestic work and caring labor, which enables formal economies to function, to the paradigms of appropriate gender and sexuality, which undergird international development policy, the prison industrial complex, and the securitization of national borders. Now, in order to further trace and specify these kinds of connections in a variety of different contexts, what we've done is assembled this extraordinary panel of scholars that you see here before you. And these comprise speakers from different probably economic backgrounds too, but I meant to say academic backgrounds and regions, as well as working in different field sites. And the goal that they've been charged with is illuminating the interrelations between political economy and the politics of gender and sexuality. So that's what they're going to be speaking to. Right, in so doing, we hope to ultimately come to a better understanding both of the social conditions, the social dynamics that create inequality and insecurity, and also to be better situated to seize the possibilities that do exist for creating social change. So with that, I'd like to just very briefly introduce the panelists, because what we're going to be doing, they've each been given 5 minutes to introduce themselves and their work. So I'll just give you a very topographical overview of who they are and what they're doing, and then they'll present themselves more fully in 5 minutes, and 5 minutes each, and if they go over that, I'm going to stand up and clap, so that'll be your cue that you've spoken too long. Okay, and we'll go in alphabetical order. And then after they've spoken, I'll maybe pose the first question, and then we can open it up. Okay, so first we have Amuchástegui, who's professor of social psychology at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana de Mexico City. Seated next to her is Cheng, who's associate professor of anthropology at Chinese University in Hong Kong. Next to is, and I apologize for this, he was previously admitted, he was not on the program, and that was an horrible oversight. So Louis Graham, who's assistant professor of community health education in the School of Public Health at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Next to him is Kerwin Kaye, who's assistant professor of sociology at SUNY Old Westbury and Wesleyan University, followed by Mark Padilla, who's associate professor of global studies at Florida International University, and finally Mario Pecheny, who's professor of political science at the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Okay, and with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Anna to begin.
So hello, good afternoon. I'm going to read because my English is not as perfect as it should be. So, feminist NGOs act more as neo than as non-governmental organizations, says Sonia Alvarez about the institutionalization of women's movements in Latin America after the Beijing conference. And she goes on, there is a certain perception that some NGOs are providing services that were and or still should be competence of the state. In this quote, Alvarez points to the contradictory process by which the region's limited and stable welfare states have increasingly delegated their social obligations to NGOs or civil society organizations in the context of a general dismantling of whatever social and economic rights were in place. New communication channels established between the state and certain forms of feminist organization, namely professionalized and funded NGOs, coincided in the 90s with pressures from the international financial institutions to impose the market as the main mediator of social relations. Dañino calls this process a perverse confluence between some of the victorists of feminist agendas and the new poverty agenda. In Mexico, gross inequality and mass poverty that resulted from structural adjustment policies motivated the Mexican government to include women into a market development model, which meant simply to implement poverty alleviation programs specifically targeted at them. One of the principles of such policies work is the construction of a gradient of vulnerability attributed to distinct populations as defined by good governance practices. A social organization of suffering is thus produced. The more suffering, the more compensation possible. Under such logic, stressing women's vulnerability to HIV becomes crucial for NGOs when resources are allocated. In the context of a concentrated epidemic where men who have sex with men, as it's epidemiologically called, are most affected, the strategy of constructing women living with HIV as victims has brought attention to the increasing numbers of infections among them. While in 1985 there were 11 men for each woman living with the virus, by 2009 the ratio had decreased to 4 to 1. This propelled Patricia Uribe, director of the National Center for AIDS Prevention, to cry in a recent meeting with health officials, "Do we have to wait for women to be half of the population living with HIV in order to do something about it?" The reason for this increase, as researchers argue, is that married or monogamous heterosexual women do not have a proper perception of risk. "Too late did I find out that marriage did not protect me from HIV," says Enriqueta, a 43-year-old clerk from Sinaloa who got the virus through her still husband. This is little surprising, since the epidemic was, and still is, constructed as threatening risk groups like homosexual men and female sex workers. But as early as 1994, the rate of infection among women who did not consider themselves as at risk was already 7 times higher than among sex workers. Faithful Mexican wives are currently, you may say, at higher risk than prostitutes. Having unprotected sex with a stable male partner has thus become a factor of major risk of HIV infection for Mexican women. Often, men's bisexual practices are called a bridge through which the virus travels to women. As Dowsett argues, such a language draws from the theorem of the AIDS epidemic that holds women as victims and men as perpetrators, and which has a powerful symbolic effect within Mexican gender culture. Such a view suggests that men get infected because of their risk practices, while women do so because of their biological, social, and cultural vulnerability. However, by tilting the vulnerability scale towards women and rendering men's social, economic, and cultural vulnerability to HIV invisible, this approach stands in the way of addressing prevention strategies among men. This is why Dworkin warns against the abuse of what she calls the vulnerability paradigm for understanding women's place in the epidemic. On the other hand, the victimized women living with HIV can only exist through the denial of women's sexual subjectivity, as desire is taken out of the equation by many state feminist accounts. Violence and unwanted sex take the place of women's sexual pleasure and become the dominant frame for interpretation of HIV heterosexual transmission. But as my fieldwork suggests, this is not the only possible scenario for many women. It was only after my divorce that I knew what love meant. So I got HIV because I wanted to live again, says Sophia, a 60-year-old domestic worker who tells the story of how she got HIV through her lover. In contrast to the discourse of women as subjects of decision that second-wave Mexican feminists articulated during the successful struggle for legal abortion in Mexico City, the representation that comes across in many discourses about women living with HIV is a precarious subject produced by poverty and exclusion, suffering also from male partner violence. It is this last component, however, that obscures the structural violence produced by neoliberal policies on women's lives. This is why discussions about women living with HIV rights are often limited to health rights, like access to services and to antiretroviral treatment. If any, it is reproductive rights that are mentioned as the main flaw of the government to address women's specific needs and demands. However, social and economic precariousness are met by both NGOs and government officials with the language of poverty alleviation programs, support for transportation and snacks so that poor women can attend HIV services are among the required government actions. Child care facilities within clinics are portrayed as a means to help women to get treatment. But little is said about women's social and economic rights, the right to paid labor, social security, and housing, among others. During last year's civil society consultation for the AIDS National Program, the head of one of the most prominent NGOs working with women living with HIV, she's not living with HIV as she usually says, stressed the co-responsibility women have in the response to the epidemic by attending health services regularly, being adherent to antiretroviral treatment, and bringing their children to regular checkups. On the other side of the spectrum, a social worker from an HIV clinic remarked, We have to be careful about the way in which we will give social support to women living with HIV, groceries, transportation, childcare, because it may happen that they get HIV in order to get this support. Whether well-behaved or abusive, women are seen as precarious subjects in need of assistance. In this context, current approaches to rights work with women living with HIV seem to find themselves in a conundrum in the face of neoliberal rationality, in which access to social services, which in fact are rights, becomes an exception destined only to subjects that can prove a certain degree of harm, that is, to victims. In this way, structurally and subjectively, assistentialism is overriding citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. So in January this year, NYPD cracked down on a high-end escort service allegedly banking on the Super Bowl weekend to deliver party packs of cocaine and prostitutes, charging them with drug and sex trafficking. And the Attorney General said that the ring involved thousands of clients and hundreds of prostitutes, primarily women from Korea. And the police was busy identifying these sex trafficking victims to try to get them out of this cycle of captivity, poverty, and abuse. And Korean women and traffickers are no strangers to these police raids. The best known of them was Operation Gilded Cage in 2005 that found over 100 Korean women in San Francisco and Dallas. Many Koreans and Americans wondered how South Korea, one of the biggest economies in the world and makers of a lot of your cell phones, could be among the countries exporting female sex slaves. In 2007, a Korean NGO with private funding commissioned a global research project on these Korean victims of trafficking. I was part of this project and had to interview Korean women in the sex trade on the East Coast. And Jin was the first woman I interviewed. She was working in a massage parlor in Queens. She came to the US after the Korean police arrested her in her own home just outside of Seoul and charged her for prostitution under the new 2004 anti-prostitution laws. She also worked in a massage parlor there. Since she was not considered a victim of trafficking, she was fined $600 for prostitution. These laws were held by the US State Department as best practices in combating trafficking. Jin realized that she needed to get out of Korea, and so she came to the US. She told me about her work. Some people only come in for table showers, massage, and chats. And I naively asked, are they the good clients? No, they are not. So who are the good clients? Those people who finish quickly, they are the good ones. Those who have shower and then have sex and go, they are the best. Together with the other 58 interviewees from the West Coast, Australia, Japan, and in Korea interviewed for the project, Jin refused to identify as a victim of trafficking. Furthermore, she was critical of the anti-trafficking law enforcement efforts and humanitarian interventions that claimed to protect their human rights. She said, I'm working hard and making money for myself. I'm not dependent on the government or my family. I'm not harming anyone, even though this is not a job to boast about. I don't understand these women's human rights. These activists don't understand us. They are people from good background. I'm not saying the anti-prostitution laws are wrong, but do they have to go so far? In light of stories like Jin's that I repeatedly encounter in my research on migrant sex workers since 1997, I would like to emphasize the ambiguous meanings of sex trafficking, widely circulated term now, and how it may serve as an instrument of neoliberal governance. The unending efforts at both global and local levels to introduce legislation, strengthen law enforcement, and offer victims protection and rehabilitation has generated a growing preoccupation with women's sexual victimhood. Yet this preoccupation to look for authentic victims who are innocent and passive reinforces the stigma of prostitution, creates a hierarchy of deserving and undeserving victims, and translates the protection of women's human rights into the protection of feminine virtues. I see the global anti-trafficking initiatives as they have taken shape in the 21st century as part of neoliberal governance, and sex trafficking as a discursive device for managing illicit sex and unlawful migration. Neoliberalism manifests itself in different forms in different global sites and is far from a consistent body of practices. So I propose to understand Jin's struggles in terms of the effects of neoliberalism as a set of 3 paradoxes. Specifically is amorality, is depoliticization of risks, and is non-humanitarianism. Paradox 1 is neoliberalism's assumption of the guise of amorality by affirming an instrumental rationality and market competitiveness while promoting a conservative sexual agenda that buttresses the family, the market, and the state. In Korea, with the 2004 laws, prostitution is no longer a problem of sexual morals and fallen women, a legal term back then, but an issue of women's human rights and prostituted women. To protect the rights of women in prostitution, the state supports a network of women's NGOs to help them through self-sufficiency programs like formal education and vocational training to clean, cook, drive, and do haircuts. The neoliberal regime presents them with the opportunities to become honest workers who do not need to depend on the state. Yet the discourse of victimization reinforces the moral values of female chastity and the heterosexual family, buttressing the moral hierarchy that marginalizes sex workers in the first place. Paradox 2 involves the depoliticization of social risks and the hyperpoliticization of national security. As an ethic of risk-taking is promoted, the social risks of poverty, illness, and unemployment are displaced onto the individual. These Korean women's migration to the US embody the neoliberal ethic of risk-taking that justifies the retrenchment of the state from the social sphere, but they then confront the increased state surveillance through border control and criminalization. Activists, however, have continued to call for straighter law enforcement to stop trafficking. The emphasis on policing over welfare could be seen in the fact that 5 times the amount of money was spent on policing than on welfare provision for these prostituted women in Korea. Paradox 3 addresses how neoliberal developments create vulnerable populations by increasing disparities in resources and wealth, while at the same time supporting a set of humanitarian responses from the state and the NGO sector. As a result of the structural readjustments that began with Korea's financial crisis in 1997, policies of deregulation, privatization, and labor flexibilization were implemented with significant gender and age effects. According to OECD statistics, Korea has the highest gender wage gap in all OECD countries at 40%. Unemployment is highly gendered. In the 2008 economic crisis, 98% of job cuts were held by women, most of them in their 30s. Unemployment disproportionately affects the young. The 20 to 29 age group made up 40% of the total unemployment population in 2006. So, some of these younger women have chosen to work overseas, often unsafely. Anti-trafficking policies and advocacy promote a racialized and sexual agenda that reproduces the social, moral, and global divide between Western middle-class female advocates and the third world women for whom they advocate, without addressing the exacerbation of structural inequalities that is compelling certain groups of women and men to opt for risky migration. In other words, these anti-trafficking measures, like many other humanitarian solutions we see around the world today, symbiotically nourish the problems they are putatively addressing. My research on sex work and migrant women in South Korea and the US since 1997 is located right at the intersection of these paradoxes. As self-sufficient, self-enterprising women who strategize their immigration and labor as sex workers who refuse to be victims, they violate the neoliberal ideals of relational sexuality and middle-class femininity that Elizabeth talks about, and therefore they embody the sexual limits of neoliberalism. Even though the anti-trafficking movement hails women's human rights, justice, and protection, its operation predominantly through the crime frame reinforces gender, class, and racial inequalities. The paradoxes outlined above help us understand the contradictory ways in which migrant sex workers embody and contest neoliberal discourses. I suggest that we should pay attention to the mutually constitutive making of neoliberal subjects and of neoliberal state practices, even in such a seemingly unambiguous phenomenon as sex trafficking. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to briefly introduce the Detroit Youth Passages Project and key constructs that have featured prominently in our work and can delve deeper in our discussion. I want to make sure that we have time to get to discussion. The Detroit Youth Passages Project is a collaboration between the University of Michigan School of Public Health, the University of Massachusetts Amherst School of Public Health, Florida International University, and 3 community-based organizations in Detroit and the youth communities they serve. Principally the Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation and Latino youth affected by gang violence, Alternatives for Girls, and the Ruth Ellis Center, and African American cisgender and transgender women and gay and similarly identified men with histories of transactional sex. It's a 5-year Ford Foundation funded project that seeks to examine and positively transform the structural conditions contributing to sexual vulnerabilities. And really the project is focused on the relationships between economic crisis, residential instability, and the context, environments, and situations. In fact, the neoliberal context, environments and situations that increase likelihood of negative sexual health outcomes. In the wake of the convergence of the partial collapse of the auto industry, foreclosure crisis, and corruption scandals, our work has centered on the linkages between formal and informal economies, young people's experiences in schools and prison, and their connections to transactional sex and sexual violence. Our inquiry has in part highlighted the incongruence between the cultural orientations of these community institutions as inscribed by their neoliberal policies and practices and the cultural orientations of groups who must navigate them. With respect to economies, we've examined some of the ways in which bodies are commodified, particularly trans bodies in the context of sexual commerce around the city and formal employment and gender transitioning. With respect to educational systems, we think about the divestment and privatization of education and its relationship to gender and sexual policing in schools as it's become less and less clear the Detroit public school system jurisdiction. In fact, sexual and gender policing that takes place in schools really serves to prepare young Black and brown LGBT people in the city for prison once dropped out and often long before begins their engagement with the criminal justice system. With respect to the prison industrial complex, we focused on over-policing of Black and brown communities, drug policy, the criminalization of sex work, the degree to which criminal and justice systems are officials are implicated as sexual assault perpetrators, and treatment of non-conforming gender and sexuality in incarceration context. Finally, there are 2 key constructs that have emerged throughout our work that are informing our current directions. The first is agency, including self-determination and having control over one's own body and life, the provision of options and being empowered to choose within these institutions, the criminal justice system, schools, both formal and informal economies. Recent conversations in communities with partners have begun to prompt us to think through what an agency assessment could look like for existing and proposed policies. So similar to the concept of health impact assessments that expose the intended and unintended short-term and long-term health consequences of policies and structural changes across all sectors, particularly communities who have traditionally been harmed by such policies. Could we develop a framework to examine agency impacts on policies in these 3 institutions is something we're currently thinking about. The second through line in this work has really been the role of memory and nostalgia as both a resilience tool and factor influencing intergenerational visions for Detroit's future, where older residents remember Detroit in its heyday, sort of Motown, an international border city, the National Auto Show, and the like. There's a tremendous pride attached to this Detroit identity and has thus made Detroit's precipitous decline troublesome, not just for the tangible and material loss, but the psychological and cultural impacts as well. Older residents draw on these fond memories to help them deal with current conditions, but it also shapes how they're thinking about what the future of Detroit should or could look like. This is in some ways in contrast to younger residents who do not have such memories on which to draw. For some of them, bankrupt Detroit is the only Detroit they know. Some of them want to leave the city or flee to the suburbs. Others are thinking creatively and progressively about urban farming, diversifying manufacturing capacity from a focus on cars to green technology, and creating a regional hub for the arts. In addition to their not having direct access to similar memories as older residents, the official public memory of the city is being erased in some ways by neoliberal policy and approach to city management. For example, the Detroit Institute of the Arts wanted to sell its collection, or the systematic bulldozing and tearing down of abandoned or vacant houses and structures rather than restoring them, or shrinking city limits that serves as a symbolic erasure of certain parts of Detroit. This memory framing is also relevant for particular sub-communities in Detroit as well, and sub-institutions like the house and ball scene in Detroit that Detroit served as a place where young people from across the country would come and they would have balls, and there was this extensive network of support among Black and Latino LGBT people in the city that has shrank in many ways as a result of the decline of Detroit, and with it, the networks of support that they brought. Young people in the city now don't have access to that institutional memory that is so important to LGBT communities in Detroit. So this memory framing, a new and attainable vision for Detroit will need to integrate sort of these intergenerational perspectives. Thanks.
Thank you, Louis. Yeah.
I'm talking about drug courts and the war on drugs. And if you don't know, drug courts basically have been instituted in New York State since 2009. New York State passed the Drug Law Reform Act, ending the Rockefeller-era laws that had been passed in 1973, and establishing a system of judicial diversion, which basically meant you, if you were arrested for first-time users, first-time people being arrested for nonviolent offenders, could go through a system of judicially supervised drug treatment rather than go into prison. So for many liberals, this appeared as a solution to the war on drugs, but my research basically shows it more as a continuation of the war on drugs, and in fact an intensification in certain ways against some populations. So just for starters, you may very well have seen a slide like this showing the rate of incarceration going up in the US, being relatively stable for many decades, and then suddenly starting to shoot up in 1973, the year Nixon announces the war on drugs, and then really starting to move up quite rapidly in 1980, 81, when Reagan comes into office. And just the past year, it sort of dipped down for the first time. What's happened simultaneous to that is that there's been a great intensification of the disparities between whites and blacks and Latinos, and particularly whites and blacks, around who's going to prison. So if you look at the chart on the left, you can see the white rate of imprisonment is at the bottom. The blue line represents the black rate of imprisonment. So precisely during the same years when the rate of incarceration is going up, the racial disparities between whites and blacks is accelerating quite dramatically, and about half that acceleration for Latinos. And then on the right, you can see that the types of crimes, the different types of disparities that happen with different types of crimes, and you can see the rate of disparity remains about the same for most types of crime, except for the red line, which represents drug crimes, where the rate of disparity between whites and blacks skyrockets. So basically what this is saying is that the greater intensification of the criminal justice system on blacks is essentially entirely due to the war on drugs. There are other causes associated with longer imprisonment terms and so on that further cause this, but in terms of the racial the increase of the racial disparities, it's basically all due to the war on drugs. And so basically what that caused was a tremendous burden and cost upon the criminal justice system. The courts became flooded with people, the prisons became overwhelmed and overburdened with having new people, and that was going to cost more money than the state was really wanting to was prepared to spend. So drug courts represented a solution to this economic crisis, this fiscal crisis that the war on drugs had essentially created, where by sending people to treatment, you could lower the recidivism rate, you could spend less money because it's less money to send somebody to treatment than it is to send somebody to prison, and it worked as a sort of a reform within this sort of new neoliberal control of black and brown populations, poor populations, making it more cost effective by seeming to provide this sort of liberal service, this treatment. So what does that look like what does that treatment look like? Indeed, you do get, Centers for Court Innovation finds a 32% reduction in recidivism, so the numbers work out very well in terms of saving money. But not everyone succeeds at treatment, and indeed about 50% fail. And disproportionately, blacks fail at rates higher than whites. And this is very important because if you fail at drug treatment, I'm not sure how you could fail. I mean, I do know, but it seems a contradiction. But when you fail at drug treatment, you generally receive a much longer prison term than otherwise, because in order to participate in the drug treatment court, you likely have had to plead guilty to a charge that's larger than if you had tried to plea bargain at the beginning and accepted that earlier plea bargain. So now you're serving, now you've spent, you know, anywhere up to a year and a half or whatever going through the drug treatment program, and then if you fail at that point, now you're going to end up serving a sentence that's longer than if you had even begun to, if you had just accepted a plea bargain. And again, this is impacting, it's differentiating between white and black populations as well as in other ways, as I'll talk about. And to talk about who the drug courts are seeing, as you can see, the felony court, 72% is the majority of the people. And just look at this first statistic, marijuana as drug of choice. 61% of the people with felonies are going into drug treatment with marijuana as their drug of choice. And basically what's happening is that a lot of dealers are being arrested, receiving felony charges, and then they're being diverted through this system. But they really don't have severe drug problems. I mean, maybe they smoked pot every day, I mean, whatever, but they're being put into residential drug treatment facilities, sort of the highest level, the most intense level of drug treatment for something that's really not a problem at that level. Basically, the district attorney at the court where I did my work said that she was, like, I asked her what would qualify somebody to get an outpatient referral. She said, well, somebody with a job. So she was very explicit and cognizant of the fact that she was, you know, differentiating her populations not based on clinical criteria, but based on public safety issues as she saw them. And basically what that meant is that the treatment system is entirely reinforcing sort of class privileges, and it's making the drug war sort of easier to bear for relatively privileged populations and a greater burden for populations that are less privileged. So let's see. So in terms of what is the nature then of treatment? Treatment does not particularly focus on stopping people using drugs. That's of course part of what they focus on, and they test people for drugs regularly. But what they're more focused on is what they call the drugs lifestyle. And the drugs lifestyle, amazingly, has nothing to do with anything happening on Wall Street, or, you know, if you saw like The Wolf of Wall Street, or, you know, like, the drugs lifestyle is specific to poor people in terms of how they conceptualize it. And the drugs lifestyle basically takes all of the old ideas of what the culture of poverty was, an inability to delay gratification, an inability to hold down a steady job as a result of that, a need for immediate gratification. It takes all those things and defines that as this drugs lifestyle. And that is the target of intervention. So the solution basically involves, well, first of all, it involves a lot of yelling. Really, to get better from drugs, it requires that you be yelled at quite a bit. It also involves shaming practices. And again, not just shaming practices that have to do with drug use, but shaming practices that have to do basically with gender non-normativity of any sort. There was, for example, it's against the rules to sleep with, to have sex with another member in the facility. And a man and woman had done that, and the woman had written sexually explicit love letters to this guy. So they stood her in front of the group, assembled the group of residents, and read her sexually explicit love letters aloud to everyone in the facility, which was much fun for everyone in the facility. They also institute collective punishments. So basically they make people enforce rules against one another. If you know of a transgression, you are required to inform the staff, and if you don't, you are subject to punishment. And at a certain point, they might decide that, well, the facility's a bit out of control, no one's enforcing the rules, we're just gonna penalize everyone. So they'll take away visits with family members or visits outside or phone calls or whatever. They also, the staff went around and destroyed people's rooms. While the group was assembled downstairs, the staff systematically went through and just destroyed everyone's rooms where they were living. So they were required to keep these rooms in immaculate condition, hospital corners on the beds and all that stuff. And the staff just took every single item and threw them into the center of the room. And of course, a collective punishment would not be legal or possible directly through the court system, but because this is sort of in a regulatory gray zone where it's outsourced to these nonprofit treatment institutions, they can get away with things like that. Basically, what I saw the treatment was doing was trying to take populations that were very accustomed sort of to a hustling lifestyle, informal labor within a street economy, and trying to make them accustomed to very low-level jobs within the formal sector. So basically, the treatment consisted of following the rules, even if they're not fair, accepting getting yelled at by the staff, even if it's unreasonable, and just following the bureaucracy. That was treatment. Basically, this is the criteria that the state has established for this population, a very poor, mostly black and brown population. This is the criteria that it has established for whether people can be free or not, whether they're going to be allowed on the streets, and or go to jail for an even longer time than the Rockefeller-era laws had established. So, so having a job at this lower tier level within the formal sector is basically, as I saw it, the essential criteria, and indeed, most drug courts make that an explicit criteria to leave. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Padilla. I'm going to try to be brief, and it's actually very convenient to follow Kerwin because we've been in dialogue on several of these nascent issues that I'm thinking about. I'm a medical anthropologist interested in the political economy of health in the Hispanic Caribbean. Most of my research in the past has been in the Dominican Republic, which is represented most clearly in my book called Caribbean Pleasure Industry, Tourism, Sexuality, and AIDS in the Dominican Republic, where I examine the phenomenon of male sex work as an expression of neo-colonial relationships in the tourism industry. That project centered on an attempt to understand sexuality and HIV/AIDS as expressions of structural factors such as migration, economic models resulting in nearly total dependence on the tourism industry, and for those of you who have been to the DR, you probably know what I mean, and the ways that stigma in the local settings creates particular vulnerabilities for young men employed in tourism, as well as their families and communities. So the health angle for the medical side took as its point of departure the finding, the epidemiological finding, that's consistent across many Caribbean nations and research sites, that tourism zones tend to show significantly elevated rates of HIV vulnerability, while often receiving less attention in terms of health policies and programs. They're pretty systematically ignored in terms of their HIV needs in these tourism areas, and I could talk more about why that is the case. So right now I'm at the cusp, at the beginning of a new project funded by the National Institutes of Health that has kind of an unwieldy title, Migration, Tourism, and the HIV Drug Use Syndemic in the Dominican Republic, or what we call in the DR just Proyecto Sindemias. That project works collaboratively with a large group of Dominican scholars, activists, government officials, and private tourism representatives on a multi-method ethnographic project that we're just beginning actually next week, where I'm going down to do the training for, that extends many of the insights from the first study that I mentioned, but now centers on understanding specifically how two structural factors, migration and tourism, shape the vulnerabilities that Dominican men face in terms of both HIV/AIDS and the drug economy. While Dominican men are our primary focus in the project, we're of course quite engaged in how the conditions of labor, gender relations, and demographic factors shape men's relationships with their partners, families, and communities. Fundamentally, we seek to understand how it is that the social consequences of the HIV epidemic and the drug economy are linked to tourism and migration. So if we pan out to the broader social, political, and economic conditions of Dominican men involved in tourism labor, what are the structural processes that shape and constrain them, affecting their health and their life chances? This is the first study in the DR to examine both HIV and drugs as part of a larger syndemic. This is a term that some of you may be familiar with, but what it really means is that we examine the clustering of health vulnerabilities that result not from risks inherent to individual people or their so-called health behaviors, but rather from large-scale structural processes and inequalities in the global system. So one of the key structural factors that I want to go into a little bit more in these remarks that's of interest to me initially in the project is deportation politics among Dominican men in particular, and its somewhat surprising connections to tourism labor. My own ethnographic research in the past has revealed that Dominican male deportees are highly visible and predominant actors in the informal tourism economy in the Dominican Republic. In one study on the north coast of the Dominican Republic, we found communities of homeless or marginally housed Dominican men who had been deported from New York City and who had found their ways to tourism areas to work as tour guides, vendors, buscones, what they often call buscones, which literally means men who find things, but just also means a middleman in the informal economy. Sex workers, also referred to often as sanquipanquis or bugarrones, and a myriad of other small-scale income generation activities. They often speak English fluently, are culturally familiar with the tourists to whom they cater, and may feel that they fit in more socially in the highly globalized spaces of tourism areas such as Sosua, Punta Cana, and Boca Chica. At the same time, these men are highly stigmatized in the Dominican Republic, arriving as individuals labeled criminals by the criminal justice system in the United States after following lengthy periods of incarceration in the United States. This follows on some of Kerwin's observations, but interestingly, they don't have the option of going into drug treatment programs in New York. They just get deported, redefined as criminals and deported. Many have suffered egregious injustices with the criminal justice system of the US and now have to carry an intense burden of stigma back home in quotes, in a country about which they may know little. These processes often lead these men to engage in drug use, sex work, or other criminalized activities as the only option for survival, severely affecting their health and well-being. For the Neoliberalisms and Sexuality Working Group, I'm interested in understanding how exploited tourism labor in the Dominican Republic is linked to deportation politics in a transnational circuit. Global tourism corporations depend on the informal labor of these men in myriad ways that are ethnographically visible on the ground. At the same time, the criminal justice system in the US is creating an endless supply of easily exploitable labor while escalating rates of deportation following on the cusp of changes in US immigration law, which Kerwin referred to, which make it easier to convert Dominicans into criminal aliens who are deportable. Faculty in Manhattan, close by here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, David Brotherton and Luis Barrios, have recently analyzed many dimensions of this circuit in their important book called Banished to the Homeland. Their work sets an agenda for future research on this topic. What expressions of neoliberalism permit this transnational circuit to be maintained? To what degree are institutional actors, corporate representatives, or government agencies complicit in this transnational circuit, which essentially exports immigrant communities to the South to provide the raw material for poor informal tourism labor in the Caribbean? And finally, what tools can be used from critical ethnography to expose and disrupt these pathways? So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Moy.
Well, very briefly, thanks Elizabeth and Janet. I will talk as a reaction of what I heard this couple of last days about New York activism and political concerns about the exclusion of LGBT people. And I will talk beyond gay friendliness, because New York as well as Buenos Aires are considered gay-friendly or LGBT-friendly cities. But friendliness means nothing if we include class, race, age, and so on into the analysis. And I would like to introduce two ideas about sexual and gender politics in the context of Argentine neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is the key category of our dialogue here. The two ideas are, the first, neoliberalism is not incompatible with the advancement of rights and recognition, especially if we think about sexual rights and gender rights. But we should distinguish between political and civil rights and social and economic rights. And the second idea is that here, as well as there, neoliberal hegemony is a pervasive framing of political practices and discourses, even of, it's a frame of those practices and discourses whose content might question neoliberalism and gender norms and heteronormativity. I will explain that in 2 minutes. The first idea, Argentina is a South American country, a Latin American country, a Catholic country. Even we have our own Pope in Rome, as you might know. And even in that context, Argentina has equal marriage. That means that gay and lesbian can get married and have exactly the same rights and obligations as heterosexual couples, including adoption and access to fertility techniques. And since 2012, we have maybe the most advanced gender identity law that protects the rights of transgender people, their right to identity, with no professional advice or precondition whatsoever, with no need to modify their appearance, body or genital or whatever. They have the right to adopt a gender identity chosen. And at the same time, they have access free of charge and universal access within the health system to hormone treatment and to surgical treatment if they wish so. So the law separates the right to identity and the rights to surgery and hormone treatments. They can have both or either one or the other. And these and other advances in terms of contraception, sex education, etc., had been obtained through struggles, social struggles, but in neoliberal contexts, because Argentina, as most countries, had suffered these neoliberal policies for a couple of decades or so. So the question remains about what does it mean in terms of social and economic justice. These laws, like gender identity law or the equal marriage law, I will make 3 little comments. First, these advancements re-signify the social and economic exclusions and inequalities, the past, the present, and the future exclusions in terms of opportunities or social chances. When political and civil equality was obtained thanks to this law, it made clear the social injustice related to gender and sexual orientation and gender that are still in place. The second comment, the recognition of rights for transgender and LGBT individuals and groups force the state and governmental agencies to implement new social policies and active interventions addressed to these new populations. For example, these focused or fragmented policies addressed particularly to LGBT youth or transgender individuals who want to have access to employment or education, etc. But most importantly, in my view, it forced to consider and reconsider the gender and sexual dimensions of existing social policies and the need to reframe the existing heteronormative social protection in a non-heteronormative way. Most social policies in Argentina, as elsewhere, are focused on women as heads of households, of children, and of families. So if families and social protection is constructed over those heteronormative units, once we take into account transgender and LGBT and everybody, this has to be done in a different way. And the third comment is, as I said, that neoliberalism, even the World Bank, IMF-oriented policies are not incompatible with the recognition of gender justice and individual and sexual rights considered individually, because the recognition of rights are cost-effective in terms of the logic of capitalism. But the question remains, as I said, in terms of social and economic justice. And the last comment, most importantly, in terms that another concept that we should discuss one day about erotic justice. The idea that the justice applied to the domain of the erotics that is incompatible, clearly or logically incompatible with the idea of victims and even the idea of subjects as rational subjects as we are the subjects of the human rights language. And the second and last idea is related to what I have said. We all recognize that in Latin America, Argentina, the US, the language of rights has become the language or the main language of politics and including sexual politics. We frame our claims in the names of rights. But maybe a perverse use of that language is the neoliberal logic of politics reduced to advocacy and the seek of power reduced to the obtention of funds. I was struck yesterday to listen to the word funds, funding, funders in a discussion about sexual politics in New York. And this is what I would call a neoliberal paradox. Social movements and actors that we consider ourselves as autonomous have become NGOs funded by foundations or co-opted by the states. In Latin America is the case, and I heard that in Scandinavia too, but this is a liberal paradox. We act as if we are autonomous actors, but in the context of neoliberal hegemony. And what I say to finish my speech is that the context of our political claims might be anti-neoliberal, but the practice in which we are inserted, embedded, and we contribute to reproduce this neoliberal logic. For example, the competition among victims. I belong to the most vulnerable group, so I deserve attention. And this is a perverse logic that contributes to reproduction of neoliberalism as producing, as we heard in the 5 or 6 presentations, produce and reproduce these vulnerabilities and suffering. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both for being timely, Mario, and for actually, that was a perfect conclusion, I think, to all the papers. And I'll just make one comment / question, and then I'll open it up. But I love that you ended with the commentary about the funding imperative. And for those of you who weren't here yesterday at the pre-conference, we had an activist panel addressing some of these same issues. And this is one of the things that's, I think, productive about a juxtaposition of field sites. Mario, who, as you know, is from Argentina, was saying, why are they so worried about funding? Can't we do activism in other ways? And some of my colleagues from Norway, who are also involved in this project, were saying, what great activists. We would never have such great, bold, vivacious activists in Norway because everything is funded by the state. So just to think about that contrast. But the question, the comment that I wanted to ask to you actually to the panel, and it doesn't have to be everybody because I know we're short on time here. I see a number of my students, I'm teaching a class on some of these same issues. The question that always comes up when we discuss the relationship between gender justice and neoliberalism, when we think about the complex intertwining of all of these categories, the ways in which even our very notion of gender justice gets folded into the neoliberal framework, is what in the world are we supposed to do then? And so I wonder, I mean, we've traversed a number of different topics, from economic restructuring in Detroit, cycles of boom and bust in Buenos Aires, criminal justice, drug policy, deportation. First of all, what do you think the implications are for taking gender and sexuality seriously to the analysis in terms of strategies for social action? And then if we think about the ways in which even our best intended interventions, feminist interventions, human rights interventions, so on and so forth, are folded into the very apparatus before we're finished articulating them, what then?
I take the opportunity also to react to our previous presentation that on race in the US, that to reduce, for example, gender justice as a question of biases or opinions, it doesn't solve anything if we don't take into account the historical processes and the social structures that are producing those phenomena. I would say that might be applied also for our issues here.
I think we're just entering a time when, I don't know if we're just entering or if it's just a reformulation, but we're in a moment when sort of humanitarian concerns have been taken up by sort of this state NGO complex that and the ways that those two are linked and used against us, as you say. And I think it just requires having a much more critical awareness of liberal, sort of the seductions of liberal solutions to some of the issues that we face, and ways that we need to bring a much greater intersectional, class-aware, international, race-aware perspective to issues of gender and sexuality, because otherwise, you know, trafficking is a very seductive frame, for example, or, you know, there's a number of many seductive frames of equality that simply then reformulate inequality, actually.
I think that one of strategies for social action,
Yeah.
right? So in South Korea, women like Jin and their sufferings as a result of these laws are considered the price of gender wars. So because having anti-trafficking laws is considered a victory for the women's movement to make its way into the institution, into the government, and so on. And so these women who suffer, well, let them suffer us because we have won. And I think it is urgent to bring Jin's stories and other women's stories into the forefront to show them that these are not humanitarian intervention that is being carried out, and is very much class-based. And when we put these stories on a global level, because US NGOs are also trying to save women like Jin, that it is about first world, third world divide. So class needs to be brought into the analysis to sort of stop the harm that is being done to the culture of poverty that we see. And also, I agree very much with Mario that a lot of the NGOs have been incorporated into the neoliberal framework. A lot of the women's NGOs in South Korea have been co-opted into the state. Now they consider themselves non-government, they consider themselves non-profit organizations, no longer non-governmental organizations, because they are getting government money. They cannot talk about sex work, even though they may find it useful. So I guess it is time, and I think it has started in South Korea, that they are trying to look for a space out. Because until 1995, women's movement in South Korea have been anti-state. And it's because of the civilian government and Kim Dae-jung, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, that suddenly the government was friendly and there was a lot of collaboration to the extent that now they don't know how to get out of this institution.
From the perspective of my work in the DR and what we're trying to do that is moving beyond issue-specific funding streams, really. I mean, we're getting back to funding again, so the starting point is a neoliberal discussion. But I think something that we're really trying to work through is how can you approach issues such as the HIV epidemic or the drug epidemic in the DR or anywhere from a perspective that is truly structural, that through institutions and NGOs that by the nature of their very survival have to reinstantiate those silos in order to receive funding. So a lot of the conversation yesterday really resonated, I think, from the perspective of a developing country like the DR that has a weak state and essentially the public health sector doesn't exist. So everything operates through NGOs that are either that are very issue specific, and they're not. There's no incentive to think intersectionally or to think structurally. And so one of the problems that we face is to try to work through those institutions that are very understandably trained to not think that way, and to develop a new modality of thinking and advocacy that would somehow be more structural and more upstream than is typically done.
It's a hard question. I wouldn't even dare to suggest something so important, but just making a reflection upon Mexican feminist organizations. There's a long-term discussion between them. They have been split after these structural adjustment policies into what they call institucionalizadas and autónomas, which means that feminist movement was quite ruptured by the ways in which they decided to forward their agenda. So the institucionalizadas has become what Matos called the state feminists, which means that some feminist agenda is taken into the state, and this is what we are talking about. And unfortunately, it has been reduced to sexual and reproductive health, maybe sexual and reproductive rights, so that the issue of class and exclusion is not really taken up by that discussion. While the autonomas who did not come into the state institutions, they have been working more closely with social movements that are not necessarily expressed in NGOs, and that, for example, are working with issues of sustainability and farming and women's place in the agrarian economy, for example. So what I would think is that the first thing to do in Mexico would be to try to introduce the discussion about the relationship between sexual and reproductive rights, neoliberalism, and NGOism, as they call it.
I mean, I would say two things. I think language is quite important, and that we have to be diligent about not allowing, I'll shorthand, the state to co-opt language, because the degree to which you can articulate and frame particular issues as distinct and different from how they're being framed and discussed and practiced in these ways that are harmful to communities and constituencies, then that is the ticket to to change. But then the other thing is a focus on changing governance structure. So it's one thing to focus on particular issues, as Mark was talking about, or even having a structural frame or lens, but where the rubber meets the road is that resources will be allocated and social goods and services will be accessed by some and not by others, and a way to the way that we deal with that is through governance. And so there has to be actual governance change, new tools and strategies for how this is done, in addition to the critiques that are being offered about particular policies or particular issues in health or economic sectors, whatever it may be.
Thank you, all of you. I know that was a complicated question, and we've only spent the last 6 weeks in my class trying to figure it out, so I appreciate it. And with that, let me open up the floor.
I have a self-interested question, and I'll pose it to Mark, but if anybody else wants to answer it, I want to hear all of your answers. And it's connected to the question that you've just asked. And so I was fortunate at University of Puerto Rico the other day to listen to the presentation by the vice chair of the Commission for Reparations on Slavery of CARICOM, which has just submitted their plan for reparations to the UK. The fifth point in that plan for reparations from slavery, for transatlantic slavery, is to say that the public health crisis in the region needs to be addressed. This is the fifth point on their plan for reparations for slavery. So, you know, I just want to know what that does or adds to the sort of reframing of the question of syndemics, and if there's anything that seems useful to you there.
Well, I mean, it sounds like I need to study up on what they're saying specifically the public health crisis is, because I think part of the question is, what is it defined as, right? Is it effective reparation if it's defined traditionally in the way that public health often defines problems as behavioral or micro-level issues of health for particular communities that are often already marginalized, and then they become re-marginalized by having it be framed as a public health crisis. So then I think I would say that the syndemics perspective, if it's taken seriously, really comes out of medical anthropology, the notion of syndemics, as you probably know, since I know you. And so it's intentionally trying to take the conversation in a very different direction and to move beyond these silos and to talk about historical processes, political economic processes, macro level structures of inequality that in theory reparations would be trying to address, right? So I would immediately be concerned with how they're operationalizing this notion of public health in that conversation, so that it doesn't become something that is, as traditionally happens, gets co-opted so that everyone can kind of sign on to public health as a thing. But then what does that really mean in practice in terms of the kinds of programs that are being implemented to try to overcome these public health crises? And I think that a lot of what's been done, as you know, on HIV in particular, as one public health crisis in the Caribbean has been grossly insufficient and has actually in some cases led to re-marginalization of particular communities like sex workers. So that would be my immediate question. I don't know if it's an answer, but.
This question is for Professor Kerwin Kaye, but I think possibly the whole panel might have thoughtful, brilliant answers. I'm interested in how the disease model in the criminal justice system, you know, applied with drug court, but also in prostitution diversion programs, which are now trafficking diversion programs. How is the application of crime as like a personal disease that, you know, you can apply a disease model to? I know there's like obvious race and gender implications and human rights abuses, but what are the neoliberal implications? I mean, how does this operate on a, you know, economic and structural way to further like entrench these and divert attention away from like addressing, you know, sex work and inequality.
Well, I guess one thing is the way that addiction gets identified as a health issue and is very class and race and gender specific. And so what it does, I mean, if you think about the drugs lifestyle as sort of a reformulation of the culture of poverty, basically what's happened is they've taken something, a set of stereotyped behaviors that they're associating with, that really is, I mean, the culture of poverty itself is sort of a revisioning, I think, of prior racial stereotypes. And then now that has become sort of a health issue, you know, so very much located in the brain or something like that. But in terms of what that looks like at an operationalized level, it has very specific, you know, treatment looks very different for middle-class people, looks very different within the criminal justice system than like celebrity rehab or whatever. And it's very much gendered, which I didn't talk about so much, but the sort of formulation of the problem and the formulation of the goals is very different for women and men. But it, again, sort of takes these issues of governance where effectively what they're wanting to do, again, is taking this pool of people who are engaged in survival work and survival sex or survival, you know, or, you know, using drugs to survive on the streets rather than whether to gain pleasure or to stay up, you know, for days at a time because that's safer or whatever, however their use of drugs is specifically going. And turning that into a brain disease rather than a structural, sort of an outcome of a set of structural conditions. And then it becomes a humanitarian gesture to offer treatment rather than just to, you know, lock people up out of the benevolence of our liberal hearts. And that's exactly, I think, the problem with, you know, the sort of humanitarian governance is that it, you know, it takes these structural concerns, turns them into individual problems, and then allows people who, you know, can disidentify from those issues to feel very good about their actual enforcement of inequality, which comes through drug courts, which comes through the prostitution courts that or the trafficking courts that you're talking about, or, you know, rescuing, you know, sex workers, or, you know, or, you know, the work around HIV and how that's working, or, you know, any of these issues. But it, you know, it just allows the structural issues to be invisible, basically. So,
from what Kerwin was saying, and also Mark, but others too, about resisting neoliberalism pulling us towards the individual, and that the response to that should be to pull again towards the structural. And I just worry about that we lose something that neoliberalism has brought forth, and that is the individual. But I'm not so interested. I understand what we mean when we say pull it away again to social structure, but there's a politics of subjectivity here that I really think we shouldn't give up that place when we think about sexuality, effective labor of sex work, and so much more, all the financialization processes by which wealth is being made is going to bring up lifestyle issues, which we don't want to, you know, concede to only those that can now afford them, and the rest of us should be like a mark in social structure, you know. So I really don't know what it means right now, but I'm very interested in thinking seriously with others. How do we do a politics of subjectivity again? And maybe that's not even the right word, but you know what I mean. I could say a politics of desire, but it will date me terribly. But I'm sure we all agree, but it's funny how that falls out a little.
I think it does pose a challenge. I mean, within the drug treatment facilities that I saw, as what I felt as abusive as they were, about half the people going through the treatment programs bought into that model in some way. The other half were just trying to get by, but you know, and maybe 10% like were just diehard, like this has saved my life, you know. And so there were ways in which that humanitarian model co-opts not just us as analysts or whatever, but the people that they're addressing, the sufferers. And you know, there are, you know, sex workers who then identify as trafficked, or, you know, and use that model and try to vocalize it. And I think that, or ways that the LGBTQ movement has, parts of it have taken on sort of a very narrow vision of equality, but taken that on. And I think, you know, we have to be aware also just of how those links to a neoliberal narrow vision offers things that we're not necessarily in a position politically to do much better.
Anna, yeah?
I think that your comment is absolutely relevant, and I can only just think about, for example, how can we, is there a possibility to connect structure to subjectivity? Should we ask questions about the connections between subjectivity and structure? And one of the things I've been looking at for a number of years is the ways in which, for example, women recognize themselves as subjects of rights, which is which would be a possibility of what Elizabeth was talking about ways to think about. And of course it happened in the United States and in Mexico in a very different way, but the discourse of citizenship linked to women is very different and produces a very different subjective effect than the discourse of course, rescuing or poor women or whatever. So I think that for neoliberalism in Mexico and regarding the feminist movement or the women's movement has affected very, 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 very strongly the pull towards the discourse of citizenship that was so important for Mexican culture that was going towards democracy, as you may call it, and now that we are sequestered by war against crime.
I think one of the points from the stories is that Jin refused to be interpolated into a subject of victim of sex trafficking. So she tried to move away from that, but she also, in that context, refused to be a subject of rights because the set of rights that is being offered is not what she wants. And in my previous work, I tried to talk about the project of aspirations. So it's not politics of desire, but we need to attend to these people's projects of aspiration.
I think the other danger in erasing the individual in our movement toward the structural is absolving key actors of their responsibility for actually moving systems forward. So these systems don't operate themselves, they don't run themselves. There are key individuals who are making decisions. So when we're thinking about criminal and justice systems and the actions of police officers, then our inclination is, well, it's systemic, right? It's not any individual police officer's fault that they're over-policing Black communities or that they're, and there's a real danger in us failing to hold key actors responsible for their role in perpetuating systems of oppression. And that's really, in my mind, the true danger, right? But also, it does offer possibilities in the way of agency, and I talked about this a little bit, if we can begin to structure systems of government and structure how we're talking about these systems in a way that also acknowledges and grants agency to actors in these key positions as well as those who are navigating these institutions and systems, then I think we would be able to successfully have a focus on structure and not leaving out the subjectivities of individuals.
Okay, so final comment from Mario, and then I'll just quickly wrap up. Yeah.
Just one among other possible reactions. The idea to use the structural thinking is maybe to inscribe the subjective experience and language into a common narrative. I always say, if you are a woman with an unwanted pregnancy, and you want to interrupt that pregnancy in Argentina, where abortion is illegal, you have to inscribe what you might feel as your own destiny, personal, only happens to me, in a narrative that is common to all women in Argentina that face illegal abortion and clandestine abortion. If you are HIV positive, I'm the only person in the world who is HIV positive. But if you can inscribe this narrative, individual narrative, in a common narrative that is not just at random that happens, that may be a structural vulnerability to HIV, because it's not at random that it happens. It might happen to everybody, but there are patterns that are structurally oriented, or I don't know, if you feel sexual attraction to a person of your own sex, also you're a teenager, you might say, oh, I'm the only one. No, you feel that way because there are a system that is homophobic or lesbophobic, or etc. This idea is not to reduce what the political, neoliberal politics is much more able to process individually the question than structurally. That's what I wanted to stress, this character.